In the build-up to the 2024 presidential election, one of the key subjects on the tip of a lot of people's tongues was the idea of a second American Civil War. For anyone paying attention, this has been a recurring trend for years now, dating back to at least 2012 when amongst some right-wing circles there were fears that Obama would enact martial law and begin putting conservatives in concentration camps. Yes, this was a real conspiracy theory. A real inception point for a lot of this began in the 1990s, believe it or not, coinciding with the rise of the American militia movement in response to the events of Ruby Ridge, Waco, and of course the government's own response to the Oklahoma City bombing. You had this growing sense of distrust between conservative Americans and the neoliberal-led government which, because of Oklahoma City, not to mention figures like the Unabomber and Eric Rudolph, was under the impression that the foremost threat to national security was homegrown terrorism, specifically right-wing terrorism. Factor in events like the 1992 Rodney King race riots, which in many ways laid the groundwork for left-wing physical pressure groups like Antifa and BLM, fueled far-left street violence, and contributed to distrust between left-wing Americans and the government. Suddenly we start to see the roots of a lot of what would manifest in the years to come. Basically, every US citizen in their 20s and younger today grew up in a country that only knew this reality and mindset, and it was only going to get more intense as they went from childhood into their teens and beyond. If you were exposed to a right-wing perspective, the government was becoming more authoritarian, socialistic, and wanted to destroy your way of life. If you were exposed to a left-wing perspective, the government was racist, corrupt, backward, and attempting to enslave you for profit. And whatever side you were on, something had to be done about it. This mentality, I believe, reached its peak in the mid to late 2010s when much of this youth population raised in this mentality came of age and became more aware of politics in the country, and the desire for change almost certainly contributed to Trump's victory in 2016, only to be followed by a hard left-wing backlash in 2020, before once again realigning in Trump's favor come 2024. And in this span of time, in this peak, we witnessed the closest the United States had come to a state of civil war before both sides in the aftermath of the 2020 election lost their teeth. It's now been around 3 decades since the first major emergence of the American militia movement. Over 3 decades since the LA riots forced the government to bend a knee in submission to rioters' demands. Over 3 decades since the United States became the sole superpower. Over 3 decades since America established a new world order of freedom, democracy, capitalism, and liberalism. The teens and 20-somethings of the 1990s are now at or approaching middle age, and have lost the muster and zeal of youth. Their successors, raised in the narratives they shaped, have mellowed out in the face of new challenges and realities that make the prospect of civil war an entertaining fantasy, something you watch movies and YouTube videos about, but not something to truly be desired in real life. Hello audience, Mr. Z here with another video for you. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We have videos like this every week where we talk about history and politics, so be sure to subscribe, leave us a comment about what you'd like to see next, and stay tuned for more. If you'd like to join the community, we do have a public Discord server linked in the description, along with a community-made subreddit loaded with memes, charts, maps, and more. And of course, if you'd like to help support the channel directly, consider becoming a channel member or donating to us on Patreon. Having dealt with censorship and demonetization in the past, especially when covering more sensitive topics, your support really goes a long way to keeping the channel going. All members do gain access to a separate members-only Discord server where you can speak with me directly. Now, let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. The years leading up to the 90s had seen some militant far-right and anti-government groups crop up, but by and large, these groups were small and far outside the mainstream. Groups like the Posse Comitatus, the Patriot Movement, and the Christian Identity Movement, to name a few. The coverage of the Waco siege and Ruby Ridge standoff really brought the militant mindset into the mainstream with the emergence of the Michigan militia, the militia of Montana, and several smaller groups across the country who felt it necessary to make a show of armed resistance to the federal government, which they feared was growing tyrannical and on the brink of suspending constitutional protections. The more extremist views of Posse Comitatus and Christian Identity remained fringe and somewhat separate from these new groups, but their views most certainly influenced the culture and ideology of various militias through intermingling and sharing of conspiracy theories. While the Oklahoma City bombing had initially emboldened some militia groups and saw them reach a peak in the subsequent year, the government's crackdown and public outrage with domestic terrorism led many to begin distancing themselves from the militia movement, leading to a gradual decline following 1996. The government took these groups as a serious threat for the time, but eventually concluded that not only were most militias harmless because of a reactionary mindset, that being that most militias were waiting for the government to make the first move, but there was also tremendous distrust between the militias, which regarded one another as compromised by federal agents, propped up entirely by the government as controlled opposition, and what have you. One FBI, or maybe it was a DHS memo if memory serves, had said something along the lines of, thanks to the legacy of COINTELPRO and similar operations, most militia groups were paralyzed by a paranoia and distrust of one another. Now in the year 1990 there were around 50 active militia groups in the US, but by 1996 there were nearly 900. And then of course come the turn of the millennia there were fewer than 200. With what some called militia frustration being a major contributor, many having become disillusioned that no revolution ever manifested. The election of Barack Obama, along with the economic downturn which led up to it, would witness a resurgence of militia groups, seeing the emergence of the Oath Keepers and the 3%ers, who along with other groups brought militias from a low of around 100 active groups to an all-time high of around 1,400 groups by 2012. With the conspiracy theories that had lingered around in the 90s taking on a more central role, namely the belief that the United States would cease to exist and be replaced by a one-world government, the belief that citizens would be stripped of their constitutional rights and rounded up in concentration camps following the enacting of martial law, the belief that a large chunk of the population would be wiped out for purposes of population control through disease, war, or extermination, the list goes on. This period especially allowed the ideology of the militia movement to spread via the internet and bring it closer into the mainstream. Prepper culture, stocking up on weapons, ammo, food supplies, and the like became a hobby right-wingers in general began to engage in. Feeding fantasies of roughing it in the woods, fighting feds under cover of forest, it was practical in some ways, being prepared for any disaster in general is good, but more than anything it grew to be extremely performative. And while some militias were very serious, for the casual prepper, this world amounted to Boy Scouts for adults. You began to have more politicians who played into this culture as well, emphasizing especially the right to bear arms, limiting government overreach, demilitarizing the police, abolishing taxes, waving around the Gadsden flag. Again, it was very performative, but not particularly practical, with a few exceptions. Obama was still in power. Globalization continued chugging forward. Conservatives were becoming a lot more aware of immigration as a major issue, fears of Islamism were reaching new highs with the rise of ISIS, conservative fears continued to rise, and the rhetoric of impending conflict was reaching a fever pitch. For many young conservatives in their teens, the scene might have appeared like a story about to reach its climax. Really, one of the fascinating things too is just how much culture fed into this and reflected this right-wing fear of approaching revolution, civil war, social collapse, or some kind of dystopia. You saw a massive rise in dystopian movies in the mid to late 2000s and early 2010s. Children of Men, V for Vendetta, heck, The Purge was a very left-wing take on this. I mean, the premise behind it is that the far-right, new founding fathers of America take over and create the purge to target minorities and the poor. We'll get into the left-wing motivations in a moment too. But the crazy thing is how the media fed this to kids, or young adults I should say. Like, probably half of all young adult novels during this period, and the movie adaptations that went along with them, had something to do with dystopia or the post-apocalypse, and that only reinforced for kids this mentality that we live in a dystopia and we need to rebel against it like they did in that movie. The dystopia stuff in media got so heavy-handed that a conspiracy theory popped up about it in conservative circles that it was predictive programming meant to get people used to dystopian conditions, instead of the more likely reality that folks noticed there was a huge market for people interested in societal collapse and just decided to capitalize on that fantasy. And also, the message in most of these movies isn't that the dystopia is good, it's to rebel against the system. V for Vendetta, overthrow the fascist government. The Purge, overthrow the racist government. Elysium, overthrow the upper class. You know, this stuff might have had more of an influence on young left-wingers than we thought. But yeah, let's talk about the left-wingers and where their Civil War mentality came from. In the aftermath of the 1992 Rodney King race riots, the city of LA conceded a massive financial settlement to Rodney King and pushed for major police reform. This sent a message to many on the left that violent action was an effective means of achieving racial justice reform. On the opposite side of the decade, the battle for Seattle, a left-wing riot of a different variety, focused less on racial issues and more on matters of economics, challenging growing globalization policies, and neoliberal capitalism, which was seen as strangling out domestic American labor, oppressing the third world, harming public health, and destroying the environment. While primarily composed of labor, nonprofit, and student groups who were gathered to oppose the World Trade Organization conference, among the initially peaceful protesters were anarchists intent on sending a message through vandalism and violence. Anarchism had been a largely dormant movement in post-war America, seeing minor revivals during the counterculture movement and during the punk culture movement, during which time anarchist groups directly engaged in altercations with the fringe far-right factions of their time, namely militant white nationalist groups whose violence shaped the anarchist perspective of right-wingers in general, making these anarchists all the more radical and violent. Clashes with police eventually saw the Seattle protests transform into a full-on street battle, with protesters being tear-gassed, arrested, and beaten. The vandalism of the anarchists really set this response off and encouraged the other protest groups to assault the officers, which of course escalated the situation. Much like the Rodney King riots, the media coverage of the event driven by the spectacle of violence brought more attention to the cause of the rioters and protesters, who began to see violence as an effective means of getting their message across, and in a way began building a closer relationship between anarchist groups and more benign student and activist movements. Among the anarchist movements in the US, those of the Pacific Northwest and Midwest were some of the most prominent and influential, with groups like Anti-Racist Action having their start in Minnesota before seeing their Oregon wing evolve into the modern incarnation of Antifa. For the most part, Anti-Racist Action and later Antifa initially stuck to their focus of combating fringe, far-right white nationalist groups, but by the 2000s and early 2010s, they bleed over into the mainstream. Anarchist black blocs became more frequent appearances at left-wing protests, right-wing counter-protests, and militia groups unaffiliated with white nationalism became new targets, earning the ire of the Torch Network, especially as the militia movement resurged during the Obama administration, with opposition to Obama being framed as racism. The bleed over of white nationalist groups into more mainstream protests did not help militia movements shake this appearance either, and the Torch Network soon began associating the two as one and the same. Simultaneously, you saw more passive movements on the left, such as the Occupy movement, which was ultimately seen as a failure, as despite attracting a good deal of media attention, the movement quickly fizzled out and failed to achieve any of its political goals, once again affirming to some on the left that more aggressive stances were necessary. The earlier Wisconsin protest of 2011, which inspired the Occupy movement, also faced similar failures, as despite mobilizing 100,000 people and drawing massive publicity to the labor movement, the protest ultimately failed to pressure any policy change. The rising racial tension of the period would only add more fuel to the flames. The 2010s would really see the emergence of BLM as a prominent movement during the Ferguson and Baltimore riots, BLM effectively acting as a negotiating body to extract political concessions from the pressure created by protests and riots, creating a successful cycle of outrage, mass action, and concession. As we approach 2016 and the election of that year, this is when all previous factors simultaneously come into play. The public fatigue with the neoliberal establishment and the policies of globalization and liberalization, which had been resisted by activist elements of both the right and the left, had resulted in the emergence of two major populist candidates, Donald Trump on the right and Bernie Sanders on the left, both of whom resonated very strongly with the youth bases of their party, far beyond what any of their more neoliberal and neoconservative counterparts could muster. However, the rhetoric that came from both men was inflammatory to the other side. To right-wingers, Bernie Sanders was a Marxist. To left-wingers, Trump was a racist and a fascist. Naturally, that view drew the attention of Antifa and BLM, the former of which by this point was still directly engaging in conflict with actual white nationalist groups, such as in the case of the 2016 Sacramento riot. But when that same attitude began being turned toward moderate Trump supporters appearing at rallies and protests, this had a radicalizing effect on the right and began to fuel the emergence of more far-right groups to counter Antifa. Earlier, a Chicago Trump rally in March of that year was canceled due to the presence of a BLM-backed protest and security concerns relating to claims that the mob was planning on storming the stage. This was seen as a huge win by the protesters, once again reaffirming the use of physical pressure and fear to extract political wins, but outbreaks of violence erupted between the mob and counter-protesters, bringing political clashes to the front page. The public response to this, especially from politicians both on the left and right, also contributed to radicalizing the Trump base, as both Democrats and Republicans appeared to blame Trump and his supporters for the violence, citing his rhetoric as too divisive and inflammatory. For Trump supporters, this was incredibly disheartening to hear, and only intensified support for Trump, as the view on the right was that the left-wing protesters were in the wrong, and the media and establishment were covering it up. Trump, of course, would win the election, sparking massive outrage on the left, especially among young first-time voters who had been convinced that Trump was this fascistic figure, and their whole lives had basically watched that if you don't get your way politically, take to the streets and pressure the government for change. Tens of thousands of protesters marched across several major cities, most of these protesters being young first-timers, and it was under this backdrop that groups like Antifa and BLM gained new supporters in liberal Gen Zers. The incident in Chicago would play itself out over and over again in the Berkeley protests, the Portland protests, at various Trump rallies and free speech events. Wherever the left and right gathered, there was the risk of conflict. The most dramatic of these confrontations was the Unite the Right rally of 2017. Motivated by the planned removal of a Confederate statue in Charlottesville, Virginia, a mass assortment of right-wingers were drawn to the city to protest and resist the removal. The event was framed as an opportunity for groups across the right to unify on the grounds of defending shared history and identity. Naturally, the event attracted militiamen, Trump supporters, libertarians, civic nationalists, but most prominently was the large white nationalist element which had made an appearance and really took lead over the protest. Counter-protesters amassed as well, featuring the likes of BLM and several anarchist and far-left groups who were all generally lumped together as Antifa by the right, though Antifa proper was also at the event. The clashes that would ensue would only intensify hostilities between the left and right, as moderate Trump supporters got swept up in the mess, witnessing and suffering violence from the left and vice versa. The moderate left-wing protesters watching Trump supporters stand alongside white nationalists made the two indistinguishable in their minds. By the end of the event, 3 would be dead and dozens injured. Trump's later statements on the event were taken out of context by the media and made to appear as though he was supporting the white nationalists despite explicitly condemning them in the same speech. To many on the left, if Trump wasn't a white nationalist before, he certainly was now, and he needed to be stopped. Still, most of the moderate left, much like the moderate right, were not willing to resort to violence, and instead more protests ensued, namely the massive Women's March of 2017, the largest single-day protest by that point, and the subsequent March for Our Lives in 2018. But it wasn't until 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which itself built upon frustrations on both sides, it wasn't until 2020 that the George Floyd race riots would rock the country for at least a year. The riots and protests would result in some 19 deaths, over 10,000 arrests, and over $500 million in property damage. The violence and destruction brought about by the left further contributed to right-wing radicalization, while the left successfully extracted major concessions across the protest period, including a long list of police reforms across the country, and the creation of the George Floyd bill to increase scrutiny of police departments nationwide. This was the culmination of left-wing frustration. This was their outburst of political violence, a year of protests and riots which saw several cities burn, perhaps poetically including LA, which had not seen that level of destruction since the LA riots of the 90s. The left had been stirred into action, radicalized by their perception of Donald Trump and the mounting social outrage of the period. The right, in turn, had grown terrified of the left and was itself prepared to take drastic action to retaliate if the left went too far. And that's one of the recurring trends we see. The left being activist and the right being reactionary. This activism would ultimately swing the 2020 election firmly in Democratic favor, and the right, both skeptical of this outcome and fearful of left-wing leadership, challenged the election's outcome, leading up to January 6th, in what would begin as the Million MAGA March, but eventually escalate into the storming of the Capitol. The fuse had finally burned down to the charge, and unlike the Unite the Right rally where radical fringe movements dominated, the Capitol riot, or rather the initial march prior to the riot, was led by Trump himself, and the crowd was largely composed of his moderate support base, though of course groups like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo Boys, and a small number of even further right groups were present as well. Upon Trump's departure, the Capitol came under siege. The politicians fled. The building seemingly belonged to the rioters. But just as it appeared things were going to escalate, that the right would finally have the revolution they had been imagining since the 1990s, Trump put out a message for his supporters to stand down, and gradually the Capitol was evacuated. The rioters left peacefully, and the momentum that had built up on the right for nearly 3 decades came to an abrupt stop. The revolution would not come. Both Gen Zers and Gen Xers were baffled. Surely something would happen. Surely Trump had some plan to take back power. But he didn't. There would be no epic climax, just a defeated whimper. And the left, back in power under Joe Biden, would retaliate. This was where their story was supposed to end too. DC was placed under military lockdown and democracy was battered but saved. The radical MAGA rioters would be rounded up and face justice for their assault on the Capitol. The villainous fascistic Trump was defeated, and he too would be locked away in a jail cell where he could never harm America again. One by one, Trump's allies were picked away, and it seemed the party was abandoning him as no longer optical. How could the Republicans support him again? There was just no way. The trials against Trump were mounting, and his pathways to a second campaign were closing. But his supporters stayed loyal. The party, as much as it tried to break away from Trump, could not do so without the people's support, and soon Trump and the party reached compromise. More than that, Trump took over the party. The legal challenges were fought, and the pathway to the presidency was kept clear. The demoralized right was reinvigorated by new enthusiasm, a new hope for victory. Attempts on Trump's life were made, and he survived it. The incumbent that the Democrats had invested so much into crumbled on the debate stage, and he was hastily replaced. And come election day, Trump achieved what no Republican had achieved in decades. He took the popular vote. He took the blue wall as he did in 2016, and he took both houses of Congress. Unlike 2016, Trump's victory was met with no riots, some protests here and there, but tame compared to what came before. No non-stop accusations of fascism or illegitimacy. He just won. And the left, as much as they despised it, accepted the outcome. Like the Republicans after January 6th, the Democrats had spent their momentum, and there was no more will to fight, just the question of, where did we go wrong? The story was over, and the Republicans got their storybook ending. Victory was brought not through violent revolution, but through smart politicking and strategizing. The Civil War dream had ended, for both sides, and in waking, a new reality stood before us. Decades of anticipation, half a decade of political violence, only for the cooler heads to prevail. Many Gen Zers are now in their 20s and late teens. Most of them are adults now, and they've learned what works and what doesn't. For the first time in a long time, it seems there is at large less fear and more optimism for what's to come, and Gen Zers recognize that they have a big role to play in shaping what that's going to be. You have the left-wing populist of 2016, Bernie Sanders, now finding himself in support of multiple Trump policies and looking forward to working with Trump on achieving compromise. Risk of conflict does still exist, of course. Some fear a resurgence of Antifa during Trump's inauguration, but that's purely just speculation. While it's likely there will be some protesting of the inauguration, the lack of left-wing momentum on the streets at this point is extremely telling, and security around DC is being increased significantly to prevent a left-wing equivalent of the Capitol riot. Trump's leadership could also be expected to snuff out any lingering political street violence, as he has vowed to use the full force of the law and the military to crack down on any riots or political violence, and has not minced words about designating groups involved in such violence as terrorists. That said, the age of fear-mongering about an impending civil war may finally be behind us, at least for a while. The fears of Gen X that began all of this are finally being retired, and Gen Z is taking up the reins while looking forward to a brighter future of possibility. But what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.